Can hear. Good morning, Zoom. Yeah. We're going to start with a couple of announcements. First of all, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Today's class is dedicated to the yard site of Mayor Ben Mordecai Friedman. It's 20 years with Toronto by his 3 children who are on Zoom, Barry and Susie Friedman, Deborah Katz, and Wendy Serlin. And I'll also mention Mazel Tov to Wendy Serlin on the birth of a grandson.
Dr. Yael.
Mazel Tov to Wendy Serlin on the upcoming marriage of her daughter to my nephew.
Dr. Yael.
Okay, so a couple more things. First of all, we're going to institute a new policy. I think it's a new old policy, and that is we're going to take questions at the end of class. What I've done for today is
Yael.
5. Yes.
We cannot hear you.
Oh, that's not good. Okay. All right. 1 second. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
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 Great, thank you, wonderful. So did you not hear the dedication that I just made? Because if so, I'm going to do it again. Okay. All right, starting from the beginning. So today's class is dedicated to the 20th yard site of Mayor Ben Mordecai Friedman by his 3 children on Zoom. You can hear me on Zoom now? Yes? By Barry and Susie Friedman, Deborah Katz, and Wendy Serlin. I also mentioned Mazel Tov to Wendy on her new grandson and on the upcoming marriage of her daughter to my nephew. So that's the dedications. I started mentioning that we're going to institute a new old policy, which is that we're going to take questions in the last 5 minutes of class. Okay, comments, questions, write them down, right? We'll get to them. I've even set my alarm, right? My alarm is set for 10:05. So we're gonna end class at 10:05. We will be taking questions and comments then. I see a lot of pleased faces here in the room. And that's true about Zoom as well, right? So I know there was a problem last week with Zoom people being heard, right? I see some of you are agreeing with me. So hopefully that will be taken care of. I also apologize for the audio quality last week on Zoom. Right? It just, sometimes things go awry, and I apologize for that. And source sheets. Does everybody have source sheets? Okay, so source sheets. Okay, so these are new source sheets. I'd like them. That way I know what you're looking at. Okay, and also for Zoom, we did put source sheets on the Google Drive at, I think, somewhere around 8:15, right? So you should have some time before class to download those source sheets, okay? All right, I'll also take this opportunity to wish Mazal Tov to Raz on her grandson's upcoming bar mitzvah this Shabbat, Yael Mishla. Her last grandson's bar mitzvah, and next year we'll start with the great grandson's bar mitzvah. So I encourage you all, please share with me your symptoms. Okay, we are returning to the beginning of Parshat Vayera, Perek Yud Chet in Bereshit, chapter 18. We started talking last time about the basic question of why does God appear to Abram, right? To what end? And for a lot of people, the idea of this appearance is connected for a lot of Mefarshim to the previous event, right? We talked about that, and that is, of course, the Brit Milah, so that we have this experience of God coming to visit Abram, to pay him a get well visit, right? So we talked about that a little bit last time. A second opinion, which I think is even perhaps it certainly doesn't contradict the first opinion, but perhaps it's even more significant, is that this appearance is just God visiting Abraham, and perhaps also as a result of the Brit Milah, right? Now that Abraham has been consecrated into this covenant, this very personal covenant with God. Can they hear me? Yeah, okay. This very personal covenant with God. So Abram finds himself in a situation in which God is very present, right? God is visiting him, and it doesn't have to come with a message. It's just God's presence. And I think that's a very beautiful idea. We ended at the last class with the idea of Rashar Hirsch, who gave it a little twist where he said, well, it's not that suddenly God has decided that he can visit Abram and be in Abram's presence as a result of Avram's recent Brit Milah. It's that God was always there, but Abram can only begin to see God and sense God's presence as a result of the Brit Milah, right? So it's like layer upon layer of trying to understand how this experience of Brit Milah may have changed the nature of the relationship between God and Abram. And all of this is pretty much a review of what we talked about last time. Certainly there's a sense that Avram's life is divided into two parts. There's the pre-Brit Milah Avram and the post-Brit Milah Avraham, and that accounts for the division into the two parshiot and for the division between last year's class and this year's class, right? So we certainly are looking at a new kind of relationship with God. That having been said, there are other midrashim, there are other parshanim that say, no. If God came to Abram in Pasuk Aleph, he has a message, right? Vayira elav Hashem. God appeared to him, Be'elonei Mamre, that's the beginning of Parak Yud. He comes with a message. God always comes with a message, right? Now, we even noted last time that the word Vayira elav Hashem is almost always followed, or perhaps even always followed by the word Vayomer. So there's already something anomalous about this appearance of God, but it doesn't mean that God doesn't eventually speak. And that's what the Bechor Shor says. The Bechor Shor explains, or Yosef Bechor Shor, 12th century French Parshan. He lived in Orleans, right, in the Loire Valley. And he explains that, in fact, this is just an introduction to the chapter, right? This initial pasuk is God is going to reveal himself to Abram in Elonei Mamre. Now we turn our attention to the arrival of these three guests. When does God's revelation actually happen? Only in Pasuk Yud Zayin. Pasuk Yud Zayin is the actual implementation of that revelation, where we're told that God says, Hashem Amar, I'm looking in chapter 18, verse 17, Pasuk Yud Zayin, the Hashem Amar, Hamichase ani me Abraham asher ani oseh, would I cover up from Abram that which I am about to do? And this is the revelation of God. It takes a while to get there. There's like a pause, but that pasuk is the introductory pasuk for the really critical event that's going to happen in this parsha. The only thing we really have to account for is why, before God actually speaks to Abram, do we have this whole kind of, side story, right? Which we will explain as well. But this is another approach. This approach says, of course, God comes with a message. The message is somewhat delayed. Okay, now there is a final approach, which I think is a very well-known approach. It is most often cited in the name of Rashbam, right? Rashbam being Rashi's grandson, very important parshan, usually a pshat parshan. And here as well, this is really what he considers to be the best pshat reading of this parak. He says as follows, and it's not just the Rashbam that says this. I'm going to show it to you also in the name of Rambam, right? This is also the Rambam's approach. And he says as follows. Let's look in source 17 from last week's source sheets. We're only going to use a few sources from last week's source sheet. So if you don't have it.
Some people are wondering about last week's sheets. They can get it upstairs.
Oh, yes, you can get the last week's source sheet upstairs after class, but I'm only going to use two sources from last week's source sheet. So don't worry if you don't have it for now. I'm just going to read for you in source number 17. It's the Ramban, but it's the Ramban quoting the Rambam. Okay, don't be confused, right? It is Nachmanides quoting Maimonides. And he's going to quote him to disagree with him, and he's going to disagree with him very vociferously, almost uncharacteristically so. But we're not going to get to his disagreement just yet. For the moment, I want you to see the Rambam, And then we're going to see the continuation of the Rambam's idea, or perhaps a little bit of a different expression of the Rambam's idea in the Rashbam. Okay, let's look at what the Ramban quotes the Rambam saying. Uvesefer Mored HaNevuchim Ne'emar Ki HaParsha Klal Uprat. This parsha is written as a Klal Uprat, right? That's one of the ways that the Torah presents ideas and also, of course, halachot, right? Sometimes it gives us the klal, right? The general idea, and then it gives us the details. Amar hakatuv tchila, right? The first pasuk says, Ki nirai elev Hashem, that God appeared to him, b'mar'ot hanivuah, ve'ech hayeta hamar'ah azot. How did this revelation take place? He sees the three men coming. That is the revelation of God, right? There's no two separate things going on here. There's no interruption of God's appearance to Abram. It's a klal uprat. Actually, it reads very nicely. I'm not sure if it's the only pshat here, but it certainly can be read as a pshat. Let's just look inside the psukim and see if we can see it inside. I'm reading pasuk aleph. God appeared to him in Elonei Mamre. He is sitting in the entrance of the tent at the heat of the day. He lifts up his eyes and he sees, and behold, there are these three men that are standing over him. Vayar, and he sees, and he runs to greet them from the entrance of the tent. Right? He bows to the ground. Vayomar, and he says, Adonai, im na matzati chen be'enecha, al na tavor me'al avdecha. And he says, my God, right? Do not pass away from here. Okay, so that's obviously only one reading, right? One of the critical elements upon which this reading may turn is how we understand the word Adonai, right? Is it Kodesh or is it Chol? Does it mean my masters or is it turning to God? Okay, we're going to leave that aside for a few minutes. There is a very well-known Gemara in Masechet Shavuot and Daf Lamed Hey, which asks the question about all sorts of ambiguous readings of Shem Hashem, right? There are all sorts of places in Tanakh where it's unclear whether a certain reference is meant to be read as Kodesh or Chol, and that Gemara goes through all of the different possibilities, and here they record a machloket, right? Some people think it's Kodesh, some people think it's Chol. But assuming that we are understanding this as a klal uprat, so then there's no problem, right? There's no question as to what is the reason that God is coming. Why does God appear and then just kind of do nothing, right? Well, the answer is that these three strangers, according to the Rambam, we're going to see that the Rashbam says something very similar, not identical, but very similar. These three strangers don't interrupt God's appearance to Abram. They are God's appearance to Abraham, right? This is the manifestation of God's appearance to Abraham. And of course, this approach assumes that these three men are angels. We are very accustomed to calling them angels. They are not called angels in this parak. Okay, they are not called angels in this chapter. They are called angels in the next chapter, right? When it comes to two of the men going on to Sodom, they're called angels, okay? But in this parak, they're just called anashim, right? And of course, here the assumption is that they are some kind of manifestation of God's presence. Are they angels? Are they shlichei Hashem, some kind of messengers of God? In any case, there's a very clear reason for God's appearance, or perhaps even three reasons, right? Because we have this famous idea, which I brought for you at the end of last week's sheet, in the name of Rashi, right? Now, the idea comes from the Midrash. It's much earlier than Rashi. Many of Rashi's ideas come from the Midrash. I like to bring for you the idea in the Midrash. Sometimes I bring it for you in Rashi because Rashi further explicates the idea. Look at the top of this week's page, right? For those people, everybody should have that. Even those people who didn't have last week's page. Look at the Midrash. The Midrash says as follows: V'hinei shlosha anashim. It identifies who these three men are. Mihayu. The Midrash does not like anonymous characters, right? And certainly given the strong kind of opinion that these three men are in fact angelic beings, the Midrash here is going to identify them very explicitly. And there is an assumption which Rashi brings in the last source of last week's sheet, which we're not going to read right now, and that is that no one angel does more than one task. Why do we need three angels? That indicates to us that there are three tasks. Angels are not independent beings. They're not autonomous, and they're not complex, apparently, right? Each one comes to do a different task. So that's what this Midrash says. V'hinei shlosha anashim. Mi hayu, who were they? Michael be'emtza. Michael, who is apparently the most important one, is in the middle. Gavriel b'yamino. Gavriel's on his right side. Raphael b'smolo. It sounds a little like Kriyat Shema, right? Raphael's on his left side. Raphael ba lirapot et Avraham. Why did Raphael come? To cure Abram. That's the Bikur Cholim, right? And of course, his name is Raphael. Michael ba livaser et Sarah. His name is Michael. Michamocha be'elim Hashem. Who is like you, God? Hayipalei me Hashem davar. Is anything too wondrous for God? Michael comes to change the fortune of an elderly woman who is past menopause, many years past, and to give her youthful vigor and to give her fertility. Michamocha be'elim Hashem. That's his pronouncement. He is Michael. The Gavriel, of course, right? The strength of God, ba lafoch et stone. He comes to overturn stone. By the way, this reading explains to us very nicely why only two of the angels continue on, right? Well, not very nicely, but I'll explain to you why, right? Because Rashi says that there is another task, and it's subsumed within one of those three tasks, and that is to save Lot, okay? To save Lot. And so Rashi says, Raphael was also there to save Lot, because the same way that he cures Abram of his malady, so it's the same shlichut, right? To save Lot and to cure Abram of his milah. There is another midrash that seems to imply that the same angel who overturned stone also had to save Lot. It's a little bit of a more problematic midrash, because then you would really only need one angel to go, right? You follow that? But the midrash, I think, is coming from the assumption that destroying and saving are the same task, which is very, very interesting, right? The same person who, or the same shaliach, the same messenger who is sent to destroy, has to also recognize who needs to be saved before he can destroy, right? I think that's a really important point. It's a very Tanakh point, right? I don't know, think Shaul and Amalek, right? No, so that's the difficult part. That's why I didn't bring for you the Midrash, right? The Midrash only implies it. It doesn't say it explicitly, but the Midrash is, I think, adding a layer of understanding to what the messenger of destruction has to be, right? Which I think in my mind, that's a really important point, because it appears in so many different contexts in the Tanakh. I started to say, and I think that it's a really good example, is Shaul with Amalek, right? God sends Shaul to destroy Amalek, and as part of that destruction, he pauses and says to the Bnei Keni, right? Of course, the descendants of Yitro, separate yourselves, I will not destroy you. So part of the act of destruction is also recognizing who needs to be saved, right? So that's, a little bit, I think, what's going on in that midrash. In any case, though, we have this idea that we have these three angels, each of which comes to do a different task. But the Rambam here seems to think that, in fact, these angels are the revelation of God. We'll see that in the in Rashbam as well in just a moment. I just want to say one thing about Kechom Hayom, right? Before we go on to the next pasuk and get to know these three men a little bit better. Abram is sitting in the Petach HaOhel Kechom Hayom. He's sitting in the entrance to the tent at the heat of the day. Everybody's interested in Kechom Hayom, right? Because it's not usual to say the time of day that Abram or that someone is experiencing something. I think that it immediately points us to something very unique about Abram. He's sitting outside, right, in the heat of the day. And of course, he has just, at least if we look at the juxtaposition of the stories, he has just undergone a serious medical procedure, right? He is suffering from it, and he's still sitting outside Kechom Hayom. I think that most of the Parshanim look at this as an indication of Avram's great commitment to Hachnasat Orchim, right? He's standing outside, sitting outside. He doesn't want to miss the possibility of hosting strangers, right? And, there are many different indications of Avram's great commitment to Gemilut Chasadim. We're going to see it throughout this story. Certainly Radak is going to be very attuned to the way in which Am Yisrael is supposed to model our nation after Avram's chesed, right? So that the idea of sitting outside Kechom Hayom. I will say one other thing. I think that there's only one other pasuk where we have that phrase, that exact phrase, Kechom Hayom. It's in Shmuel Bet, Perek Daled, when these two men, Rechav and Ba'ana, come to chop off the head of Shaul's son. Remember that? Ishboshet, right? Remember that? Or Mephibosheth, right? They come to it's in the story of the Shaul story, right? They come to Ishboshet, and he is, the pasuk tells us, they come Kechom Hayom, and what is he doing? V'hu shochev et mishkav tzaharayim, hatzarayim, right? He's sleeping. What do you do, Kechom Hayom, in a Mediterranean climate, right? You sleep, right? Which I think on one level testifies to, again, Avram's great commitment, right? He doesn't want to sleep. That's, I think, one kind of understanding of this. Radak is going to go in a really different direction. And he's going to say, and I think it may even be based on the connection to this pasuk, that this is an indication that the whole story takes place while Avram's sleeping. Okay, and that's in the wake of Rambam. Okay, that this whole story is a mar'eh nivu'ah, right? Because when you do Kechom Hayom, and if you're sitting outside in the heat of the day, right, you're clearly asleep, right? Because you wouldn't be able to stay awake in the middle of the day. Okay, in any case, we have here Hu Yoshev Petach HaOhel, and in Pasuk Bet, Vayisayin Avayar, V'nei Shlosha Anashim Nitzavim Alav. You have these three men who are standing over him. I just want to mention that there is a actual halacha that is being learned from this, and that is that we sit while we say Kriyat Shema, and God is standing over us, right? There's this, maybe even what I said before, right? Mimi, Michael, Misravi, Gabriel, Milfanai, Uriel, Varoshi, Shchinat, El. That's what we say, right? When we're saying Kriyat Shema. But there is a midrash that explains that we learn that we're supposed to sit when we say Kriyat Shema. From this, there's something very interesting about the scenario, right? Avram is sitting, and these godlike figures, angelic figures are standing over him. Sometimes I think about it because, right, it seems to be more reverential to stand, right? That's how we approach God in Shemona Esrei, right? It always seems a little strange to me to sit when we're saying Kriyat Shema, but at the same time, it testifies to a certain permanence, right? You're sitting, you can't move around. And I think even perhaps more significantly, it suggests that God is honoring those who are saying Kriyat Shema, right? God is hovering there. God's presence is there. So that's just sort of a side point of something practical that emerges from these psukim. These three strangers, right? Vayisayin Avayar, V'hinei Shlosha Anashim Nitzavim Alav. the word vihine indicates something surprising, right? Always, right? Vihine, and there they are. Behold, we have these three men. What is surprising here? Well, one thing that is surprising is that they come to Homayom, right? That's not a time that we usually have people passing by. They're very well-known midrashim that talk about how God brought them to Abram because he saw that Abraham was mitzta'er. He was very upset. He was very concerned that guests weren't coming. We even discussed this a little bit last time, that he felt perhaps that the milah was keeping them away, either because they were being considerate of his medical situation, or perhaps we even mentioned the possibility that they feel now distanced from him, right? Abram is in a brit with God. He is on some kind of higher level. We're going to stay away. We don't feel worthy of coming into his presence. However you understand it, the fact that Abram is sitting outside eagerly awaiting this, and when it does happen, it's certainly the description, when they do come, the description of Avram's response to these strangers certainly corroborates all of these readings, right? The readings are there, all of these approaches are there to say to us, Avram, for all of his spirituality, for all of his closeness to God, he remains very deeply ensconced in the world of treating the others properly, right? In the world of chesed. And this is certainly something that is very much associated with Avram. Abarbanel suggests that this word vihine indicates that they kind of appear as an apparition, right? In other words, one minute he sees them very far and he blinks and they're just there. Vihine, they're suddenly there. And the Abarbanel actually, throughout his reading of this section, he's going to say that Abram knew that they were angels, which is a really big question, right? It's a really big question. Does Abram know it, or at what point does Abram know that he is dealing not with human beings, but with some kind of, whether you call it angelic beings or just, messengers of God, representatives of God, right? That's certainly the way that the Parshanim understand these men. At what point does Abram understand? So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the Abarbanel certainly thinks that right away he understands, right? That's the vihine, how they appear here. I saw them, off in the distance, and then suddenly they appeared right next to me. Now, the Rashbam, I want you to look at source number 19. The Rashbam is really the one who is often credited with this idea that we saw before in the Rambam, right? Because the Rashbam really reads this idea consistently into the whole story, and that is that the Vayera Elav Hashem, the revelation of God, is what happens with these three angels. In general, Rashbam, whenever you have God speaking, he'll often explain it as in the guise of the angel, right? In who's in that section, right? When the Vaydaber Elav Hashem, I think he might explain something similar with the story of Hagar. Look in source number 19, Vayera Elav Hashem. He'ach, how did God appear to Avram? Sheba Elav Shloshah Nashim Shayu Malachim, because three angels appeared to him. Shebeharbe Mekomot Shenirah HaMalach Koreu B'lashon Shchina. Many times, when you have an angel, he is referred to as God. So that, as I said, when it says Vaydaber Elav Hashem, and there's an angel in the parak, the Rashbam is going to say that's the angel speaking. Right? So for Rashbam, he's going to read this consistently throughout the parak. He's going to read this into the parak. I brought for you a couple examples. In source number 19, where he says, whenever it says Vayomer Hashem, right? You see, right in Pasuk Yud Gimel, when it starts out Vayomer Hashem El Abram, Lama Zeh Tzachaka Sarah, right? Why did Sarah laugh? Rashbam says Hamalach, right? Gadol Shabahem, right? The greatest of them, who is Michael, right? In Pasuk Kaf, Vayomer Hashem, right? Za'akat Stone va'amorah. And that, of course, is when God reveals to Abram that he is about to destroy Stone. So Rashbam says, Hamalach, It wasn't a different revelation. This is the revelation, right? The speech of God to Abram throughout this parak is in fact what these three men are doing, right? They are giving God's revelation to Abram. In Pasuk Kavav, Vayomer Hashem, Rashbam says Hamalach, and also in Pasuk Kav Gimel, when the Pasuk tells us that Avraham Odenu Omein Lifnei Hashem, Avram still standing before God. Rashbam says Lifnei Hamalach. That is him standing before the angel. So there's no problem here. Well, we're going to see that it seems that in the other reading, the reading that doesn't conflate the appearance of God, the revelation of God in Pasuk Aleph, with the story of the three angels, according to that approach, we have to ask ourselves, how could Avram interrupt his experience with God, his communion with God, to go and deal with these three strangers, which I think is a wonderful reading. That's one of the reasons that I kind of hesitate to internalize Rashbam's approach too much, because I really love the other reading. I really love the idea, which we'll see in a moment, that Abram is talking to God, or he's communing with God, and suddenly he says, sorry, gotta go. I have people here, right? So, we'll get to that in a moment, but, this does resolve that question, right? Rashbam says, it's not a question, right? The whole thing is one continuous story. All right, everybody follow that? That was clear? The one time that I think that the Rashbam is willing to say it's talking about God in this parak and not about God's messengers is when one of the angels or one of the three men say to Avram, Hayipalei mehashem davar, is anything too wondrous for God? And there again, we're talking about God, right? Again, there's sort of a conflation here between shlichei Hashem, right? The messengers of God and God himself. But, this is all, I think, well and good for the Rashbam. And as Rashbam himself said, he applies this pretty consistently in other stories as well. Now, I want to mention something, a direction that the Rambam takes this in, which is the direction that Ramban is going to be very opposed to, but not the Rashbam, right? This is not the Rashbam's approach. Was that clear? Yeah. Okay. So I want to show you something that the Rambam says. First I'll just start by saying it's sort of a derivative of this approach, right? In other words, Rambam says that this first verse, Vayera Alav Hashem, indicates that the whole story is the Vayera Alav Hashem. But for the Rambam, this story doesn't actually take place. It's a Mar'eh Nivu'ah. That's what the Radak says as well, right? That's what Radak says. Radak says that this is a Mar'eh Nivu'ah. He fell asleep, right? We saw it before. It was Kechom Hayom. Why was he out there Kechom Hayom? Well, because God wanted to give him a Nivu'ah, right? And this Nivu'ah, again, you see a little bit the problem with it, at least my personal problem with it, is that a little bit takes away from Abram, right? From Abram the person. But that this whole story for the Rambam is Abram's prophetic experience. It's his prophetic dream, meaning he's learning things from God, right? He's learning from God, perhaps what he should do with strangers. And for the Rambam, I will say some things that I think that it kind of fixes. One, of course, is that these angels seem so human, including the fact that they eat. Right? In Pasuk Chet, right, we're going to be told, right? They eat. Everybody's going to ask the question, what's they eat? Remember the angel that comes to Manoach? When Manoach tries to give him food, he says, if you give me food, I'm not going to eat it. Lo chal mimenu, just bring it to God as a korban. Because I'm not going to eat that food. He doesn't explain why, but it's very clear that he is hinting to Manoach that he's an angel. So if that's the case, so how do these angels eat? So the Rambam says, no problem, they don't really eat. This is a dream. This is a prophetic vision. And Radak picks up on this, and over and over and over throughout the parak, he says, Kol ha'inyan hazeh haya b'mar'eh nivu'ah. Kol ha'inyan hazeh haya b'mar'eh nivu'ah. All of this is taking place in some kind of prophetic vision. Look at Radak here. I'll have to find my source sheet and see. I can tell you what number it is. Look at Radak here in source number 20. Okay, source number 20. V'tachem lefaresh ki kol sipur advarim ha'ela ad ve'Avraham shav limkomo. This entire story until Abram went back to his place, which is the last pasuk of this parak. It was in a vision. When did he get this nivuah? He was sitting in the entrance. He was drowsy. He dozed off, and he got this mar'eh nivuah. Now, for Ramban, he's going to take this even a step further. Ramban is not going to accept this at all, but he's going to take it a step further. He's going to say, well, once you say that this is a mar'eh nivuah, well, the next chapter also has to be a mar'eh nivuah, because the next chapter is very much the continuation of this chapter. Why would the Radak stop it here? If we're talking about some kind of prophetic revelation, right? And all these angelic beings are acting so human. And that's, let's say, perhaps the Rambam's problem with assuming that this actually happened, right? That you can actually meet an angel in this kind of corporeal human form, and he would actually act like a human and eat. Well, then you have to say it about next chapter also. The same two men, or 2 out of 3 of the men, continue on to Stone, and they eat there, and they and this goes on and on until the end, of the story of the overthrowing of Stone. So let's look at what the Ramban here has to say, because I think the Ramban here gets sort of unusually emotional about this issue. First, of course, he brings a Sefer Moreh Nevuchim. We saw that before. Let's look at this second paragraph in the Ramban in source 21, starting with the words Ve'im b'mar'eh. Ve'im b'mar'eh lo nir'u elav rak anashim ochlim basar. Ech amar vayira elav Hashem. Right? If all of this was just in some kind of mar'eh, how can it say vayira elav Hashem? Kinei lo nir'alu Hashem. Lo b'mar'eh v'lo b'machshava. V'kacha lo nimtza b'chol ha'nevuot. Right? This isn't the way that we see other things working in Tanakh. This seems to be his strongest objection. He says, according to the Rambam's words, which the Radak follows the Rambam, lo lasha Sarah ukot, v'lo asa Abraham ben Bakar, v'gam lo tzachaka Sarah, hakol b'mar'eh, right? Here didn't actually happen. So this seems to me like a chalom sheker. It's like a false dream. What's the purpose here? So I mean, that's what I find a little less compelling. I mean, I could see a purpose in a dream that didn't actually happen. It could be to teach Abraham about chesed. It could be to teach Sarah about believing in God. But look at the next paragraph. I skipped. It's a very long Ramban. Look at the next paragraph. He says, according to this approach of the Rambam, yitzarech lamar can be inyan lo. You'd have to say the same thing about lo, right? As I said before, ki lo ba'u malachim al beito. No angels ever came to his house. V'lo avalem matzot ve'yochelu. He never baked anybody matzot and they ate it. Right? Everything was just some kind of vision that Abram gave. That Abram received. Right? So he says, he seems to think it would be Lot's vision, not Abram's vision. He says, how come we're suddenly saying that Lot can receive a prophecy? And what about the Anshe Stone? Were they also receiving a prophecy? Omi gilahem shebao anashim el beito. V'im hakol mar'ot nevuato shel Lot. Yeh. קום קח את אשתך, ויאמר הימלט על נפשך, והנה נשאתי פניך, בכל הפרשה כולה מראות. Everything that happened. The angels that came to take Lot out of the city, and the whole story with Lot's wife, and the whole promise that Lot is going to be saved, and the pre-story also, of course, where Lot, by hosting these strangers, shows that he's deserving of being saved. So Ramban really doesn't like this approach. Now, as I said, let's just read one more line here from the Ramban, and you'll see how much he doesn't like this approach. He says, "Aval yechashev shayu ha'maasim na'asim me'alehem v'hama'amarim b'chol davar v'davar mar'eh." Right. So it seems that these things are just happening not in real life, but in some kind of vision. Ve'ele devarim sotrim hakatuv. These things contradict what's written. Asor l'shom'am. You cannot listen to them. You certainly cannot believe them. Okay, so Lot is sorry.
Clarification. Does this mean Sodom, according to Rambam, does this mean Sodom wasn't destroyed? Was that also?
Yes, according to the Rambam's understanding of the Rambam's reading. I don't think the Rambam says this explicitly. According to the Rambam's understanding of the Rambam, none of this happened. Sodom wasn't destroyed. Lot wasn't saved. Abram didn't host any angels. All this happened in Avram's head, right? So, you can understand, I think, on one level, why Ramban is so disturbed by this, just on the pshat level, right? This is a story that happened. We're told that it happened. It's very, it seems to be a very significant story, one that plays itself out throughout the Tanakh, the destruction of Sodom. And again, Ramban doesn't say that explicitly, that according to this, Sodom wasn't actually destroyed, but it certainly seems to be what he's trying to say. So you can understand why this disturbs Ramban. But there is something else that seems to be going on here, and that is something that I learned from Rav Ezra Bick, who has a wonderful virtual Beit Midrash shiur on Ramban on the Torah. And here, he explains that it cuts to the heart of the difference between the way that the Rambam and the Ramban understand Nevuah. For the Rambam, this is not, these three men coming to Abram, it's not Nevuah, it's not prophecy. It's an experience of communion with God. It's an experience of experiencing God's presence. Rav Bick explains that for the Rambam, prophecy is always intellectual. It's always about receiving wisdom. It's always about receiving ideas, right? And therefore, and also again, the Rambam has all sorts of his, rationalist issues. Rav Bick didn't talk about this, but I think we're also sensing that the Rambam does not like the idea of these angelic beings coming in this very human form. That clearly is something that bothers him. But for Ramban, what is prophecy? What is the goal of this story? The goal of this story is to experience God's presence, to experience some kind of meeting with a divine presence, right? And that's something that is he explains that's what's really motivating him here, is that it's really important to him that the story is about how human beings can experience God's presence. Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand what is so troublesome to the Ramban, but I think some of the things that we've, that we sense here, right? Especially, I think that the story didn't really happen as it's told, or it didn't happen actually. I think that seems to be really motivating the Ramban. But the second approach, or I don't know, we called it the second approach, or the third approach, the other approach, right? The approach that in fact these three men are totally separate from God's revelation, right? That's the approach that is better known, right? This is the approach that I think, it's Rashi's approach. We always know better Rashi's approach. And in this approach, and the Midrash clearly says this, God appears to Abram, and then suddenly the three men arrive. And these are two separate and distinct events. And this is what we have. Look in source 22. In source 22, we'll look at those paintings in just a moment. Look in source 22. The Midrash Tanhuma says, Shemal Abraham, when Abram got circumcised, and he was very ill, right? He was suffering from the circumcision. Amar Malachim leilech levakro. God said to his angels, go visit Abram. But before the angels actually went, God said, you know what, I'm going to go. And afterwards, right? And these are two separate things. Now the Midrash brings it to say what an anav God is. Right? Is there any God that is as humble as God, right? That God comes to visit Abram, his servant, and he wants to be there before the Malachim. Okay, so this is the Midrash. But what is wonderful about this Midrash, and of course, this is the more, I think, common and seems to be the simpler way of reading the story. But what's wonderful is what we saw, what we've already noted, and that is this in this Midrash. I mentioned it last time, but we didn't see it inside in this Midrash I brought for you here in source 23, where Abram says, Vayomar, Adonai, Imna matzati chem beinecha, al na ta'avor me'al avdecha. Now, it seems, the pshat seems to be that he's talking to these three men. But this Midrash says that this is what he's saying as he's going to running to greet the three men. He turns to the guy and says, God, excuse me 1 second, I'll be back in a minute, right? And that seems to be, even if you don't understand those words as being directed to God, because I don't think that's the pshat, right? The pshat is that he's directing those words to the three men. But the Midrash is picking up on the fact that he leaves God without a so much as by your leave, right? Excuse me 1 second, I'm going to go attend to those men. He's sitting with God and he sees the men, he gets up and he runs, right? And so this Midrash says, Vayomer Adonai lahakadosh baruch hu amar. He said this to God. Shelo yisalek shtinato misham kedei she'elech likrat orchim. Right, so that his he won't leave, he won't take his presence away when God goes to greet when Abram goes to greet the guests. Mikan amar lamad shegedola achnasat orchim yoter mikabalat penei hashchina. From here we learn that it is greater to bring guests into your house than to sit with God's presence, to invite God's presence in. Ibn Ezra brings this as an option, right? Also in source 23. He says, V'yesh omrim ki Abraham bikesh reshut ma'ashchina, right? Some people want to say that this pasuk is Abram asking permission from the Shekhinah. In my mind, it doesn't really make so much of a difference. I mean, it's nicer if he asks God's permission, right? But it's just as powerful, I think. Both ways are just really extraordinary. Actually, Rashar Hirsch, which I didn't bring for you here, understands these words as a tefillah that he's murmuring in his heart, right? That as he's running to greet, he says, Hashem, don't leave. And then he runs, right? But he's not speaking to God. He's speaking, inside of himself as he's running. He's like, oh, I hope I'm not doing anything wrong. Which again, there is a sense of that accompanies Abram. We would expect that to accompany Abram. But if that's the case, if he asks for permission, if he doesn't ask for permission, if he's murmuring in his heart, please give me permission and don't leave while I'm gone. All of these things ultimately come out the same. Because Abram does something extraordinary. He puts Ben Adam L'Chavero before Ben Adam L'Makom in a very, very real way, right? In a way that is, I think, really very shocking, right? There's this sense that, that Abram is making a very clear choice. I'm sitting with God, but there are people that need me, okay? So I think that that's wonderful, right? Radak, as always, likes to learn the Musar Haskel, and he says here, it's in the same, I think it's in the same source, in source 23, the last one, "V'lamdu mizeh ki gdola achnasat orchim yoter me'akbalat pnei hashchina," right? We already saw that. Achnasat orchim is more important, is greater than even bringing God's presence or greeting God's presence. But look at what the Radak then says. "V'nichtav kol hasipur hazeh kedei sheyomad adam lehitnaheg im habriot b'tzedakah uvechesed." And so this is just Radak saying what I think we all know, which is that the whole story is here to teach us how we should behave, right? It's really nice that Abram did that, or it's really kind of shocking that Abram did that, but Radak says that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is that Abram becomes the role model. If we ask ourselves what's more important in our lives, that's the answer, right? That's what Radak says. So, Abram's behavior towards his fellow man. This is my post-election speech. I didn't say anything about elections, right? Abram's behavior towards his fellow man emerges from the recognition that there is the Tzelem Elokim in every human being, right? That there is a godlike quality in every person. Don't forget, these strangers, they are not circumcised. They are not Jews. They are just people who are passing by. And Abram chooses to acknowledge their Tzelem Elokim, their humanness, their essential rights and dignity as humans, the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to feel safe, right? The right to be treated like a human being. All of this is what is guiding Abram. And this, I think, is really an essential point, right? This is the point that I think is also made by the fact that the Torah opens with 11 chapters that are universal chapters, right? 11 chapters that are about humanity, that are about Tzelem Elokim, that are about how human beings are all Tzelem Elokim. They all have a certain godlike quality in them, and therefore they all deserve the right to dignity. Okay. So I want to look just for a moment at these two paintings. Now, I found this wonderful book, okay? I get no cuts for this, but this is, it's a beautiful book. It's called Brushes with the Bible. It appears in Hebrew as well. It's by Yardena Lubatsky and Ruth Mark, right? I think they both live in Efrat. And what they do is they go through art on all of the different stories in Bereshit, and they explain how the different artistic renditions are parshanut. And it's just a beautiful book. It's beautifully done. And it's called, what's it called in Hebrew? Oh, in English, it's called Brushes with the Bible. Yeah, this one's in English. It's in Hebrew. It came out first in Hebrew, but then it was translated into English.
Most of the artists are not Jewish.
No, not at all. Look who I brought for you here, right? So what I brought for you here, and this is, again, this is their explanation of these two pictures. I don't know how well you can see them on this photocopy. I think you can see it pretty well. These are two different artists that depict Abram's encounter with these three men, right? If you look at Gustave Doré's picture, right? 19th century French, right? It's clear that Abram is, well, there's something very dreamlike about the picture, right? It feels much more Maimonidean than Nachmanidean, right? There's something very dreamlike about the picture. I mean, in general, Christians especially, but everybody portrayed angels with wings, right? That's sort of a classic attempt to indicate that these are angels, but look, they're above Avram, right? Itzaviv alav is very extreme. There's almost a feeling like they're not grounded, right? There's something very unrealistic about the picture. But what's interesting about the picture also is that Abram clearly understands that they're angels, right? There's no indication that Abram, I mean, there's no reason that Abram wouldn't think that they're angels, because they're clearly angels, right? This is what he's saying. Whereas in this second, this is a little bit harder to see, but this is already when these three men are under the tree, right? And Gerard Poet, I probably mispronounced that, this Dutch 18th century artist, right? So well, those dates are definitely wrong, right? Look at that, that does not make sense. Okay, sorry, I can look back in the book, but clearly there's a typo here. But in any case, in this picture, they're clearly men, right? They're sitting under a tree. They look like men. It does not look like a dream at all. There's nothing dreamlike about the picture. But this is the machloket between the Rambam and the Ramban, right? And that's how they present it also. I mean, it's a very learned book. And so I thought, oh, that's a nice thing to show that this kind of representation of the story remains a machloket in art as well, right? And that's true. I mean, art is always it's always a parshanut. It always involves exegesis. I remember when I was looking for something artistic to put on the front of my root book, and I went through every biblical art that I could find, every piece of biblical art that I could find on the book of Ruth, and I just couldn't agree with anything. Because there is always a measure of exegesis, and you have to buy into every little detail. So I put on a nice wheat field by Van Gogh that I could sign off. Yes.
I'm gonna send you one.
1733. Esther says, thank you very much. Okay, I will mention also, just as it's a little bit of a side point, but I think it's interesting. It appears in several parshanim. We're moving past this question of the Ramban and the different ways of reading the story of these three men. But some of the parshanim here on the story, especially when they're relating to the question of the men as angels, tackle Christian theology a little bit. Now, of course, for Christians, the arrival of three men is very fortuitous, right? They certainly see it as anything three, right? So they certainly see it as an indication of the Trinity. And Bechor Shor, right? I mentioned before, Bechor Shor from Orleans, right? Late 12th century. So he's certainly contending with Christian theology. And look at what he says here in source 24, right? And by the way, the Bechor Shor in general, Rav Yosef Bechor Shor, who was a student of Rabbeinu Tam, he's one of the Tosafist school, and Rashbam, right? A little bit of a younger contemporary. So he is explicitly anti-Christian in many of his perushim, right? We see often he engages in some kind of polemics against Christian theology. Look at what he says here. First, he says, "Vayar." In source number 24, "Vayar v'nei shlosha anashim lefi pshat anashim mamash." He said, it seems like according to the pshat that these are really men. Right? We don't usually have malachim that eat and drink and lie down and go to sleep, as we'll see also in the next parak. Right? He brings the example from Manoach that I cited before, but skip ahead to the next line. But we can't really argue with the ubiquitous approach that these are malachim. And that's, of course, based on the fact that in the next chapter, they will be explicitly referred to as malachim, right? So he said, really, basically, everybody agrees that they are malachim. So he said, but umihu al kol panim, in any case, asur lehorot lifnei haminin shahayu malachim. Right? You can't teach in front of minim, he means Christians here, that these are angels. Shehu re'ayalahem al karputam sha'achal, because this has become a proof for their, I'm going to just say, craziness. Okay, right? So that's his approach. Look at what he says. Also, look at the continuation here on page 6. Look at what he says on the first pasuk in the next parak. He's going to offer actually a piece of textual evidence that he's going to use against Christian theology. Umizeh pasuk tshuva leminin. Right, this is the pasuk that tells us in the next parak, Vayavo shnei malachim stoma. Why does he like this pasuk? because the Trinity has become two, right? So that for him is very helpful, right? If they're no longer walking around in a group of three, so then you can't prove anything, right? So he says, this is proof to those who say that those three malachim are the Trinity. And what we can easily respond to them is, right? What happened to the third part of the Trinity when they came to stone, etc. Okay, so this is, it just gives you a little bit of a taste of how directly the Bechor Shor contends with Christian theology, and I don't know, almost I'm a little afraid for him when I read this, right? So I almost without fear, I don't know how much the Christians were censoring or reading. This clearly remains uncensored. He says it, seemingly without any hesitation. I will mention one more parshan that directly relates to polemics with Christians here, and that is Ibn Ezra. And that's interesting because the Ibn Ezra, of course, grows up in Muslim Spain, right? Until around 1140, at which point he was forced to wander. And when he wanders, he finds himself in Christian lands, right? So he finds himself in Christian Spain and in Italy and France. You know where he ends up at the end of his life? In England, right? Which I used to always say, wow, isn't that neat that the Ibn Ezra probably spoke English? But it was Old English, so none of us speak that English anymore. But I don't know if he spoke it in any case. His life was very difficult. He wandered a lot. And here's why I didn't bring it for you on the source sheet. I figured the source sheet is long enough, but I'll just mention that the Ibn Ezra here as well talks about the Trinity, right? He talks about this concept. Okay, so we have here in Pasuk Bet, Abram lifting up his eyes and seeing. Vayisa enav vayar. He lifts up his eyes and he sees. Abram is always seeing, right? The Abram is the seer, right? One of the things that I think that that we say about Abram as, sort of just to almost encapsulate who Abram is always at the tops of mountains, right? He's always looking afar, right? He looms large over the story. He can also be seen from afar, but he's looking far into the distance. It's almost a metaphor for who Abram is, right? Abram is the one who is forging the path of Judaism. As such, very important that Abram sees. Sight is always insight, right? Someone who sees, it means that they comprehend. There's it's not just a passive seeing. It's also, there's something here very almost gradual and built up about this sight. Vayisa enav, he lifts up his eyes and he begins to see. He sees something significant that is happening to him. Now, what's interesting is that also later on in the pasuk, we again have the word vayar. He sees again. Right? What is he seeing here? That is twice, right? So, perhaps what we're seeing here is a gradual or a slow process, right? Vayisa vayar. V'hinei shlosha anashim nitzavim alav. Vayar, right? He's slowly beginning to comprehend that he is having a very significant experience. For Rashar Hirsch, this is him seeing that God is with him, right? God was always there, but he has to open his eyes and see it. Rashi says, right? Rashi is something similar to what he says about Moshe. They have a similar kind of thing with the pasuk that describes Moshe emerging from the palace. You remember? Right? Vayigdal Moshe vayetze elecha vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'echav vayar b'sivlotam. Right? We have vayar, right? That, he sees, then he sees even more. He sees deeper, right? He's understanding. It's beginning to dawn on him. I can't believe it. Is that possible? Okay, so
Yael,
just finish this
Yael,
point.
I just want to let you know
That's
that the
why
source sheet on the drive is.
Wait, I would have even checked my watch at this
Can't hear
point.
me.
Okay, so I'll say a couple things about these two vayars. Rashi here says that if you look in source number 25, Mao vayar shnei pamim. He saw twice. Harishon kimashma'o. The first one is what it says. He sees something. Hasheni lashon havana. The second vayar is when he begins to deeply understand. Now, for the Ho'il Moshe, in source number 26. This is one of my new favorite Parshanim. I found him on Al HaTorah, right? Some of you may remember last year. I think 19th century Trieste, right? Perhaps also a student of Shadal or in the Shadal world of Parshanut. He said that the two Vayars, the second Vayar, comes to tell us that Abram understands that these men are angels, right? And that's a really important question. At what point does Abram understand that they're angels? So for the Ho'il Moshe, it's here. This is when he understands that they're angels. It begins to dawn on him that in fact he is having a divine he's having an experience of meeting divine beings, right? Now, Abarbanel also thinks this, not for the same reasons, but Abarbanel also thinks that Abram understands right away that he's meeting an angel, he's meeting three angels, and he's meeting Shlichei Hashem, messengers of God. Others, and I think it's probably a more logical reading, like Radat Hoffman says, he doesn't understand until much later in the story. Only after these men tell him that next year at this time, Sarah will have a child. And the difference between them, and with this, I'll conclude, the difference between them is in fact that the angel, Abram's going to give the angels food, right? If Abram knows that they're angels, then he shouldn't be offering them food, right? And so there is some kind of understanding that's happening here, but it's a gradual realization. It doesn't happen right away. I'm going to conclude with one final point. There are people who have sight, and then there are people who don't have sight. Who doesn't have sight? Yitzchak. Now the words Vayisa einav vayar also appears with Yitzchak. Where? Yeah, good. Vayisa einav vayar, and he lifts it up his eyes and he sees. He sees camels. Vatisa Rivka et eineha vatera. She lifts up her eyes, and what does she see? We don't know what she sees, but she falls off of the camel. Right? Sight meets lack of sight. And I do have to conclude by saying, though, that Yitzchak's lack of sight is part of the story. It's not something negative, God forbid. Avram's looking forward, and Yitzchak is looking backward. A seer cannot be followed by another seer, or the vision will change, right? So Yitzchak is not meant to have sight. He's meant to be the Ish Misorah, to look backwards. Okay, I'm going to open now the class for questions. Also on Zoom. Hello, Zoom. Whoever would like to
Can you hear us, Yael?
please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Nope, can't hear us. She can't hear us. They need to tell them that she can't hear us.
Okay, I'm going to repeat your question. This is an excellent question. It's a very important question. How is the message that Sarah is going to have a child any different than the message in Perek Yud Zayin? It's a really important question, and we will deal with it. Right? Everybody asks that question, and everybody should ask that question, and we'll talk about it either next time or the time after. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, couldn't Abram have been awake because of pain?
Awake because of his pain, as opposed to.
He wasn't the type to just drink himself to sleep.
Well, look, I mean, it's a machloka. We have no idea if Abram was. The question, wait, I'll just repeat your question. The question is wouldn't Abram have been awake because of his pain as opposed to asleep because of his pain? Again, you could use proofs on both sides. We don't know. The difference between the Rambam and the Ramban is not whether Abram fell asleep, right? The difference between the Rambam and the Ramban is, do we have those sort of experiences in real life? Is that something that is supposed to be part of our relationship with God? Or is that something that we can only experience in the deep recesses of our unconscious? And if you say that, then you use Kachol Mayom to mean that he fell asleep. But logically, did he fall asleep or did he stay awake? That's not a logical question, right? We don't really means to know that. And the pasuk doesn't tell us that he fell asleep. So that's just
say that because I'm just saying this as if
A
I learned.
definition of what a malach is would be a very good idea if I had any idea.
They can't hear us. They
You
can't hear us.
Yeah.
Dr.
No, I think
Ziegler,
also, yeah, and
Dr.
also look,
Ziegler?
a malach, it means different things among different people. That's why, we don't really know what a malach is.
Dr.
Some-
Ziegler? Dr. Ziegler?
Yeah,
Dr. Ziegler?
yeah,
Is it for me?
yeah.
Phyllis?
Go ahead, Phyllis.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see your Tanakh. It's an experience just to watch you with the Tanakh, the way it's so used. My husband just wrote a book on pain, and actually he's in pain now with the shingles. And it's interesting to see, we just had a bar mitzvah and he danced. He just overcame the pain. And I think, and if everybody could dive with him, I really appreciate it. It's Moshe David Ben Shena. He's in a lot of pain, but he's overcoming it. And we appreciate that. When I saw Mrs. Naftali Frankel, Racheli Frankel, she said that her little kid at the time, her son was killed, Naftali, that her other little boy said, listen, when we do Gabriel, could I add to it my brother who was killed, Naftali? And it was a very moving moment. And I try to say it every night to include him.
Well, I'd like to wish your husband a refuah shlema, and you should not have any pain. That's our Hashem.
Can I ask?
Yeah,
Yael,
go ahead.
I just want you to know, I tried to send a message. The source sheet that was sent out for today is really last week's. So we don't have the updated one on the drive. Now she can ask a question.
Now, I got it from the drive. Maybe
I'm
you
sorry?
looked at the wrong one. It was there.
No, I had 2
I
dates.
downloaded
I don't
it
want to
this
take
morning.
time for it. I
I'm
just,
very sorry
what-
about.
It is on the drive. I got it off
It
the
is.
drive. I
So
printed it
I
out
also
early
did.
this
Yes,
morning.
email me,
All
I
right.
will send you the source sheet.
okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yael, how could Sarah conceive before her husband was circumcised? Did anybody hear me?